Let me paint you a picture. It is 2:30 in the afternoon. You have a task in front of you. It is not hard. It does not require creativity or courage or any particular form of genius. It just requires you to sit there and do it. Maybe it is data entry. Maybe it is reading the 40-page compliance document your company needed reviewed by last Friday. Maybe it is cleaning out your inbox, or organizing your receipts, or doing the thing that has been sitting on your to-do list so long it has basically become part of the furniture. And you cannot do it. Not because you are incapable, not because you are scared, but because every neuron in your brain is staging a quiet revolt. Your eyes drift to the window. You refill a coffee cup that does not need refilling. You find yourself reading the Wikipedia page for the history of elevators, which, and you will admit this, is actually more interesting than you expected. This is not laziness. This is not a character flaw. It's your brain doing something completely predictable, and once you understand what it is doing and why, you will have the actual tools to work with it instead of against it. But first, a small confession. The title of this video promised you a trick, and I want to be honest with you about that word, because I chose it carefully. A trick implies a shortcut. It implies cleverness over willpower, and that framing is actually scientifically accurate in a way that most productivity advice is not, because the research is very clear on one point. Willpower is the wrong tool for this particular job. Let me explain why. Your brain has two systems that are relevant here. The first is your dopaminergic system, the network responsible for motivation, anticipation, and reward. This system does not respond to importance. It does not care that the expense report is due tomorrow or that your future self will be deeply grateful if you spend the next hour organizing your tax documents. The dopaminergic system responds to one thing and one thing only, the expectation of reward. The second system is your default mode network, the part of your brain that activates when you are not engaged in a focused task. It is the mental wandering engine, the daydream generator. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Your default mode network is not a bug. It is one of the most metabolically active regions in your entire brain. It is always running, always generating, always looking for something more interesting than whatever you are supposed to be doing. So, when you sit down to do something boring, you are not fighting weakness. You are fighting two of the most powerful neural systems in your head simultaneously. One is starving for stimulation, the other is actively generating alternatives, and you are attempting to overpower both of them with a sticky note that says, "Focus."
No wonder it is not working. The traditional advice here is to just push through, build discipline, do hard things. And look, we talked about that in our last video, and there is real value in building that muscle. But boring work is a different problem than hard work. Difficult work challenges you. Boring work numbs you. And the brain's response to numbness is not effort, it is escape. So the question is not how to force your brain to comply. The question is how to change what your brain is actually experiencing during the task. This is where the neuroscience gets genuinely interesting. Researchers studying motivation discovered something called the dopamine prediction error signal. Here is how it works. When your brain receives a reward it did not expect, it releases a burst of dopamine. Not just at the moment of reward, but retroactively, strengthening the behavior that preceded it. This is the mechanism behind habit formation. But the same system can be deliberately manipulated. A study by Caitlin Woolley and Ayelet Fishbach at the University of Chicago found that people who associated a boring task with an immediately enjoyable experience, not a future reward, but something pleasant happening during the task, persisted significantly longer and reported higher levels of engagement. The technical term for this is bundling. The colloquial term is giving your dopamine system something to chew on while your hands do the boring thing. This is not distraction. Done correctly, it is the opposite. You're not splitting your attention, you are changing the emotional texture of the experience itself. And there is a second mechanism at play that is even more powerful. It is called flow state induction, and it requires understanding something counterintuitive about boredom. Boredom does not occur because a task is too simple. Boredom occurs when there is a mismatch between the level of challenge and the level of skill. A task feels boring when your brain has excess capacity, when the cognitive demand is so low that your default mode network has nothing keeping it occupied and immediately starts generating escapes. The solution is not to make the task harder. The solution is to add a layer of meta-challenge on top of it. We'll get to the specific techniques in a moment, but I want you to sit with this reframe first because it changes everything. You're not trying to become the kind of person who enjoys filing expense reports. Nobody enjoys filing expense reports. You are trying to engineer a specific neurological condition, mild challenge, immediate feedback, and enough sensory engagement to keep your default mode network from wandering that makes the task completable without a heroic act of self-discipline every 30 seconds. That's the trick. Not a motivational speech, not a morning routine. A small, deliberate manipulation of the conditions your brain is operating in.
All right, let's get specific, because I know what happens at this point in most productivity videos. The science sounds compelling, you nod along, you feel briefly understood, and then the advice arrives and it is, try the Pomodoro technique. And you close the tab because you have heard that 17 times and your tomato timer is currently being used as a paperweight. So let's talk about what actually works, and more importantly, why it works at the neurological level. Because when you understand the mechanism, you can adapt the technique to your own brain, instead of following a script designed for someone else's. The first technique is what I call gamified metrics, and it is grounded in something called operant conditioning with variable reward schedules. This sounds complicated. It is not. It is the exact same mechanism that makes slot machines and social media feeds impossible to put down, and you can deliberately point it at your expense report. Here's the basic structure. You take your boring task and you add a layer of measurement to it that your brain can treat as a score. If you are doing data entry, you count how many rows you complete in 10 minutes and then try to beat that number. If you are reading a dry textbook, you write down one surprising fact per page and see how many you can collect in an hour. If you are cleaning, you set a timer and race it. This sounds almost embarrassingly simple, but the neuroscience behind it is not simple at all. When you introduce measurement and the possibility of improvement, you activate the same neural circuitry that makes games compelling. Your brain releases small pulses of dopamine each time you hit a micro milestone. The variable nature of the challenge, sometimes you beat your record, sometimes you fall short, creates exactly the kind of unpredictable reward schedule that the dopamine system finds most engaging. You are not making the task interesting, you are making the performance of the task into a game, and your brain, which has been playing games since before you could read, knows exactly what to do with that. The second technique addresses a different problem. Sometimes the task is not just boring, it is isolating. It is the kind of work that makes you feel like you are alone in a room with something deeply unpleasant and no one is coming to help. For this, the research points to something called body doubling, and the findings here are striking enough that they deserve their particular attention. Studies on individuals with ADHD who experience the boring task problem at an amplified level consistently find that simply having another person present in the same space, even a person who is doing entirely unrelated work and not speaking, measurably improves focus and task completion rates. The mechanism appears to involve your brain's social monitoring system. When another person is present, your prefrontal cortex remains slightly more activated than it does in isolation, as though a part of your brain is maintaining social awareness, and that ambient alertness leaks over into the task at hand. You are less likely to drift because some part of you is still, in a very low-level way, performing.
This is why coffee shops work for so many people, not because of the caffeine, because of the ambient presence of other humans doing things. You can replicate this deliberately. Study with a friend on a video call. Use one of the many body doubling apps and websites that have emerged for exactly this purpose. Put on a live stream of someone else quietly working. You are not being distracted by other people. You are borrowing their presence to keep your own prefrontal cortex slightly more online. The third technique is the one I want to spend the most time on because it is the most misunderstood. It is the strategic use of sensory pairing. Remember the Woolley and Fishbach research I mentioned earlier? The finding that pairing a boring task with something immediately enjoyable dramatically increased persistence. The key word in that research is pairing, not replacing. There is a critical distinction between giving your brain a pleasant sensory experience during the task versus using that pleasant experience to avoid the task. The rule is this: certain kinds of enjoyment consume cognitive bandwidth, others do not. Watching a complex drama while doing data entry will pull your working memory in two directions, and you will do both badly. But listening to music, the right kind of music, occupies the part of your brain that would otherwise be generating escape routes without competing with the task itself. The research on music and cognitive performance is nuanced, but the general pattern is consistent. Familiar music with a moderate tempo and no lyrics tends to improve performance on repetitive tasks by elevating mood and arousal without creating competing cognitive demands. Your brain has a processing layer that runs beneath conscious thought, and if you do not give it something to do, it will go looking for something on its own. Music occupies that layer. It is cognitive occupancy for the part of your brain that would otherwise be planning your escape. The same logic applies to other sensory elements. A specific scent you only use during work, a particular kind of tea, a physical environment you associate exclusively with getting things done. These are not indulgences, they are environmental anchors, sensory cues that your brain, through repetition, begins to associate with the state of focused work. Over time, the cue begins to trigger the state automatically. This is a process called context-dependent memory and behavior, and it is why so many people find it easier to work in a library than at home. The library has accumulated enough associative weight in their nervous system that simply entering it begins to shift their brain toward the working state. You can build your own version of this deliberately in whatever space you have available. Now, let me bring these three threads together because the real power is not in any single technique. It is in the combination. You take your boring task, you add a layer of gamified measurement so your dopamine system has something to track. You arrange for some form of body doubling so your prefrontal cortex stays slightly more engaged. You pair the session with carefully chosen sensory input that occupies the part of your brain that would otherwise wander. And you do this consistently enough in the same space with the same cues that the environment itself begins to carry some of the load. None of this requires you to become a different person. None of it requires a heroic act of self-discipline. It requires you to understand that your brain is not your enemy. It is a system, and systems respond predictably to the right inputs. The boring task is not going to become exciting. Let's be realistic about that. Filing your taxes will never feel like watching a great film. Reviewing the compliance document will never produce the same neurological response as a conversation you actually care about. But it can become completable, reliably, without the 2-hour negotiation between you and your own nervous system that currently precedes every task you would rather not do. And that, over the course of a career, over the course of a life, is not a small thing. The people who move consistently forward are rarely the ones with the most talent or the most passion. They are often the ones who figured out how to keep moving even when the work was dull. The ones who built the infrastructure of execution around the things that matter. To help you put this into practice, I've put together a free one-page reference sheet, the Boring Work Toolkit, that lays out these 3 techniques with specific examples you can apply to the most common types of low-stimulation tasks. The link is in the description. And if you watch this and thought, my problem is not boredom, my problem is that I cannot even start the important things because they feel too large and too frightening, that is a different video. A good one. You can find it right here. Thanks for watching. I hope something in here gives you a specific thing you can try today. Not next week, today. I will see you in the next one.